Welcome to the debate. Right now, in March 2026, international development partners are looking at Zimbabwe and facing, an incredibly complex landscape. The real question on the table today is where to direct diplomatic and strategic engagement to actually foster stability.
Yeah, and the choices are stark. The political ground is shifting rapidly under our feet, almost daily.
Exactly. We are specifically looking at the strategic efficacy of the newly formed National Democratic Working Group, the NDWG. They are building this massive counterforce to the ruling ZANU-PF party's internal consolidation.
Right, but we have to weigh that long-term political strategy against a very different perspective. Local civil society leaders are arguing for an immediate, fundamentally different focus. They are fighting for basic survival.
This isn't an academic exercise. This debate emerges directly from what is happening on the ground right now. We have the ruling party's push for Constitutional Amendment number 3. We have the devastating fallout from the April 2025 Private Voluntary Organizations Amendment Act, and against all of that, the recent launch of the NDW's grassroots campaigns.
It is a critical moment for the international community to decide where to put their resources.
I will be arguing that the NDW's long-term political mobilization, along with their comprehensive economic blueprint, offers the most credible, structured alternative strategy for international partners. If you want lasting stability, this is the vehicle.
And I'll be representing the perspective of those frontline civil society leaders. From their vantage point, the NDWG's political posturing is, it's fundamentally inadequate. It doesn't address the immediate existential threats that are literally obliterating civic space in Zimbabwe today.
So let's lay out the case for the NDWG clearly. International development partners are frankly exhausted by fragmented short-term opposition politics in Zimbabwe. They want a pragmatic alternative that can actually govern. The NDWG presents exactly that.
But you can't govern a democratic transition if the democratic actors are all in prison or worse.
Which is exactly why the NDWG's structure is so vital. They've launched what they call Operation Vuzure, or Imbuselelo Ndebele. This is a bottom-up mass mobilization strategy, actively operating across all 12 provinces. This isn't just a few elites holding press conferences in Harare.
They do hold plenty of those at the media center, though.
Well, they do, but it is backed by a massive structural realignment. The leadership, including Chief Facilitator Job Sikala and Acting Chairperson Dr. Waraye Zembe, are doing something incredibly intelligent here. They are explicitly targeting ZANU-PF's internal fractures.
You're talking about the so-called 23rd Agenda?
Yes. For our listeners evaluating these political dynamics, the 23rd Agenda is essentially a ruse. ZANU-PF uses these official initiatives to cover up early, vicious internal campaigning for their 2027 elective Congress. The NDW is calling this out. They're exposing the ruling party's vulnerabilities to the public, offering a unified counter-narrative.
I understand the political calculus. I do. But grand political blueprints mean absolutely nothing when the fundamental right to exist is being stripped away.
It's not just political, though. They are bringing a highly sophisticated economic alternative to the table. Their national treasurer, Safi, has laid out a structural roadmap that development partners have been begging to see for years. We're talking about commercializing land to make it productive, reverting to the US dollar to stabilize hyperinflation, digitizing government services to physically eliminate the touch points where corruption happens. They are preparing for a post-crisis Zimbabwe.
Preparing for a post-crisis Zimbabwe is a luxury. I channel the viewpoint of local civil society leaders who are currently navigating an absolute nightmare. The focus on future electoral cycles and internal ZANU-PF factionalism is profoundly disconnected from the immediate crisis.
You don't think long-term planning is necessary to solve an immediate crisis?
Not when the house is actively burning down. We have to look at the reality following the April 2025 signing of the PVO Amendment Act. Just to ground this for the international partners listening, the Private Voluntary Organizations Act isn't just bureaucratic red tape. It didn't just shrink civic space. It fundamentally criminalized it.
It's certainly forced a massive reorganization of how funding is distributed.
It allowed the state to freeze assets, shut down NGOs at will, and dictate internal operations. Freedom of association is gone. That's why the European Union completely withdrew its good governance funding. You speak of economic blueprints, but a blueprint doesn't protect an activist being abducted, tortured, and beaten in the streets of Harare.
The violence in February 2026 was horrific, without question.
It was state-sanctioned terror. Civil society leaders are looking at international development partners and saying, you must prioritize immediate human rights defense. Funding a future political alternative while the present civic infrastructure is being dismantled piece by piece is a complete strategic failure.
Let's look closer at how the NDWG is actually tackling this political reality. You mentioned the immediate crisis, but the NDWG is addressing the root cause. The state violence is a symptom of ZANU-PF's internal succession battles.
You're referring to the split between President Emerson Mnangagwa and Vice President Constantino Chiwenga?
Exactly. Ahead of the 2027 elective Congress, the ruling party is tearing itself apart. The NDWG isn't ignoring this reality, they are leveraging it. By exposing this intense factionalism, they're showing the populace and international partners that the ruling party is inherently unstable.
But the ruling party is using that instability to consolidate even more authoritarian power right now.
And the NDWG is fighting that. They're actively fighting the 2030 agenda, the proposed constitutional amendments that would extend Mnangagwa's term, but they are doing it by building a parallel, mass-driven structure. They're bypassing the traditional opposition politics that have historically failed in Zimbabwe.
I have to jump in here, because this is where the civil society perspective completely breaks from the political perspective. The NDWG talks confidently about outmaneuvering ZANU-PF at the 2027 Congress, but civil society is fighting an actual, literal constitutional coup happening today.
You mean the gazetting of Constitutional Amendment Number 3?
Yes, which happened just last month in February 2026. Let's be very clear about what Amendment 3 actually does. We are not just talking about extending a presidential term to 2030. This amendment replaces direct elections with parliamentary selection.
It is a massive institutional shift, I agree.
It is the end of electoral democracy in the country. It also fundamentally alters the military's constitutional role. Instead of being mandated to uphold the Constitution, the military will now act in accordance with it, a subtle legal shift that formally entrenches military rule.
Which is why a massive, coordinated political response is required.
But while the NDWG is busy trying to outmaneuver ZANU-PF's 2027 electoral mechanics, the ruling party is rewriting the rules of the game so that 2027 doesn't even matter. You cannot fight a 2026 constitutional rewrite with a 2027 electoral strategy.
That implies that a purely defensive civic strategy can stop a constitutional rewrite.
Local civil society leaders argue that this moment requires immediate, unified civic resistance. We need urgent legal challenges, massive international diplomatic pressure, and physical protection for those speaking out against Amendment 3.
But hasn't that approach failed repeatedly?
To development partners, funding long-term political posturing while the Constitution is being shredded is like investing in a new roof while the foundation of the house is actively collapsing.
The foundation of the house has been collapsing for 2 decades. The traditional methods of civic resistance, filing legal challenges within compromised courts, or organizing localized protests that are easily crushed, have not stopped the structural decay.
So we abandon the legal and defensive fight.
Not abandon it, but recognize its limitations. The NDW's approach realizes that you cannot defeat a systemic constitutional overhaul with fragmented civic resistance. You need a national, mass-driven political vehicle. And frankly, international partners are looking at the checkbook. They do not just want to fund perpetual resistance.
They want a return on their democratic investment.
They need a partner with a credible, rigorous economic vision. If a transition actually occurs, the country cannot immediately collapse into financial ruin. This is where the NDW truly sets itself apart.
You want to talk about public financial management while the Constitution is being rewritten?
International partners have to look at the whole board. Look at the detailed proposals from the NDW. They are laying out plans for strict lifestyle audits to finally stop public corruption. They are specifically addressing the barriers to foreign direct investment.
Foreign direct investment is meaningless if there is no rule of law to protect it.
Which they acknowledge. They recognize the severe risks of double taxation and currency instability. That's why they are proposing a full return to the U.S. dollar to stabilize the markets. More importantly, They're addressing the devastating environmental and economic leakages happening right now in the mining sector.
The situation in the mining sector is a tragedy. I will concede that.
It is a catastrophe. Look at the Chinese lithium mining operations in Buhera. Wards 4 and 6 are being systematically destroyed. Farmlands are being ruined, water tables are polluted, and the local communities see absolutely zero economic benefit. The NDWG is explicitly promising transparency and value addition in these regions. For a development partner, you need to see this level of sophisticated governance readiness.
I acknowledge the economic degradation. The lithium mining destruction in Buhera needs international spotlighting. But from the perspective of local civil society, engaging in high-level economic seminars about double taxation is an absolute luxury.
It's not a luxury, it's the foundation of a viable state.
Civic space is entirely closed. How do you implement an economic blueprint when the architects and advocates of basic rights are fighting for their physical lives?
The two are not mutually exclusive.
Let me remind you of the reality civil society is operating in. In August 2025, Job Sikala's own home was bombed. We saw the month-long detention of independent journalists. Blessed Mlangagwa was locked up for 71 days simply for reporting the news.
The persecution of journalists is abhorrent, and the NDWG has heavily condemned it.
Condemnation doesn't stop the torture. We witnessed the horrifying incommunicado detention of activists like Robson Chair, Namatai Kwakweza, and Samuel Gwenzi. They were pulled off a commercial plane and held without access to lawyers. They were tortured.
The state's brutality is exactly why a new political vehicle is necessary.
From the civil society perspective, international partners must prioritize funding legal defense right now. They need to fund emergency extraction protocols and physical protection for civil society actors, over and above the NDBG's future economic promises.
But if you only fund defense, you never go on the offensive to change the system.
If there is no civil society left to hold the future government accountable, the NDBG's economic blueprint will simply be inherited by a different set of elites operating in a vacuum of accountability. You cannot build a democracy on the ashes of your civil society.
I completely agree that the violence against activists like Sherry and Kakweza is horrific. But pausing all political and economic capacity building to solely focus on emergency defense is a trap. The state wants international partners to constantly play defense.
It's not a trap, it's triage.
Look at how the NDWG is uniquely structured, though. It actually provides a more resilient form of protection against this exact state violence.
How does an economic blueprint stop a night raid?
It's not the blueprint, it's the grassroots mobilization. The NDWG operates on a deeply frugal, self-funded model. They aren't relying on massive, centralized, elite funding structures.
Because the PVO Act made that impossible.
Exactly. The traditional civil society organizations are highly vulnerable to the PVO Act precisely because of their formal structures and their reliance on foreign bank transfers. The state can freeze those assets with the stroke of a pen.
So what is the NDWG doing differently on the ground?
They are defending a genuinely grassroots approach. Citizens are literally donating chickens and fuel to fund local ward meetings. By refusing to formally categorize themselves as a traditional political party or an NGO, they're creating inclusive democratic working groups.
Which is a semantic difference the state security apparatus does not care about.
It matters because it encompasses a much broader swathe of society. We are talking about churches, informal vendors, traditional leadership, and the diaspora. It makes the movement incredibly decentralized. The regime can decapitate a formalized NGO. It is much harder to decapitate a community-funded network of working groups spread across 12 provinces.
That is an incredibly idealized view of grassroots mobilization in a deeply authoritarian state.
It is practical, sustainable resilience.
Local civil society groups, the ones actually delivering frontline services and monitoring human rights, view this movement very differently. Despite the NDW's reluctance to use the term political party, the state sees them as one.
But their informal structure protects the participants.
Does it? Sweeping political movements often draw severe regime retaliation directly onto highly vulnerable rural communities. And they do it without offering those communities any actual protection.
The risk of state violence is a constant in Zimbabwe, regardless of who is organizing.
But the risk amplifies when a massive political mobilization engine comes to town.
When the NDWG sets up a working group in a rural ward, state intelligence takes notice immediately. Look at what happened to Sikala's book launch.
That was a tragic disruption, yes.
It was a violent attack by ZANU-PF youth militias. Guests were assaulted, and the police explicitly refused to intervene. Or look at February 2025, when Job Sikala and 39 other NDWG members were raided, assaulted, and detained by police in Mutare. And what was their crime? Holding a meeting.
Which only proves how threatened the regime is by this mass mobilization.
It proves that mobilization generates casualties. When a movement relies on citizens donating chickens and fuel, it sounds inspiring. But when the state rolls into that village with profound violence to punish the people who donated those chickens, what mechanisms does the NDDW have to protect them?
They rely on the collective strength of the community.
Collective strength doesn't pay for hospital bills or legal fees. Civil society argues that development partners must fund organizations that actually have the capacity to monitor these abuses, provide medical and legal aid, and sustain the victims. You cannot fund a political engine that generates casualties it cannot support.
Remaining stagnant carries an even greater risk. The state violence you describe isn't a reaction to the NDDW. It is the baseline behavior of the regime.
But the NDDW is accelerating the confrontation without the infrastructure to handle the fallout.
They're attempting to channel that localized suffering into a coordinated national voice. Look closely at how meticulously they are auditing their structures. They've evaluated all 12 provinces. They openly acknowledge that not all structures are performing equally well.
Transparency is rare in Zimbabwean opposition politics. I will grant them that.
It's vital for international partners. Dr. Zembe has made it clear that the ultimate goal is a national democratic people's consultative convention. They want the resolutions and the answers to the crisis to come directly from the people.
A consultative convention takes years to organize effectively.
Development partners have historically struggled with top-down political organizations in Zimbabwe that fracture at the first sign of state pressure. The NDWG is built from the bottom up. They emphasize zero wastage, extreme frugality, and direct citizen ownership. It is a long-term investment in genuine democratic infrastructure.
But you're treating the disease while ignoring the fact that the patient is bleeding out on the table right now.
Treating symptoms indefinitely is not a strategy for international development partners.
Treating the symptoms keeps the patient alive. We are analyzing strategic efficacy for March 2026. The EU has already pulled funding due to the PVO Act. The state is actively consolidating power through Amendment 3.
Which is why the NDWG's parallel structures are so important.
But the 2030 agenda is moving forward through legislative fiat. It completely bypasses the democratic structures the NDWG is trying to build. When Dr. Zembe talks about formulating ward, district, and provincial working groups, civil society asks one simple question: to what immediate end?
To build a critical mass that cannot be ignored.
The state will simply use its newly expanded constitutional powers, including the altered role of the military, to declare every single one of those working groups illegal or subversively partisan.
Which will expose the regime's illegitimacy to the world.
The world already knows they're illegitimate. Look, development partners have finite resources and finite diplomatic capital. If you direct that money toward a slow-moving, massive consultative convention while the ruling party is actively rewriting the Constitution, it is a massive misallocation of resources.
I disagree completely. Supporting the NDWG's structural growth does not mean abandoning human rights.
It means diverting critical funds away from immediate survival.
No, it provides a much more robust vehicle for that defense. The state weaponized the traditional separation between civil society and political opposition through the PVO Act. They regulated NGOs out of existence.
Which is exactly what we are fighting.
But the NDWG is blurring those lines by creating a working group model that explicitly includes churches, vendors, and the diaspora. They make state regulation nearly impossible, and they are integrating socioeconomic survival directly into their political platform.
Give me an example of that.
When Safi outlines the NDWG's commitment to prioritizing health care, ensuring that no Zimbabwean dies due to a lack of basic supplies like blood transfusions, he is speaking directly to the humanitarian concerns of development partners.
promises of future healthcare don't deliver blood transfusions today.
They are addressing the mass migration of professionals by proposing a systemic overhaul that restores dignity and economic opportunity. This holistic approach is exactly what development partners have been asking for. They want a comprehensive strategy, not just endless defensive legal battles in courts that are heavily compromised by the executive.
A holistic approach is wonderful in theory, but execution requires an enabling environment that simply does not exist in Zimbabwe today.
You build the enabling environment through mass mobilization.
You mentioned the courts being compromised by the executive. That is exactly why the focus must be on immediate survival and international pressure. If the courts are compromised, how will the NDWG ever see its economic policies implemented?
Through eventual electoral victory and a mandate from the people.
But Amendment 3 shows that the ruling party can simply change the Constitution to remove direct presidential elections entirely. You're relying on a system that the regime is actively dismantling.
The regime cannot dismantle a fully mobilized population.
Civil society leaders are intensely frustrated by this exact logic. They are witnessing the complete dismantling of democratic guardrails. When the state uses explosives to bomb activist homes, when the NDWG leadership themselves point out the profound cowardice of this system, the response cannot just be a promise of better health care and digitalized government down the road.
It is a promise of structural change.
The response must be immediate, coordinated protection and resistance. International development partners must realize that if the 2030 agenda succeeds through these constitutional amendments, the NDW's provincial structures will be systematically dismantled before they ever reach an election in 2027. The focus must remain laser-sharp on the immediate existential threat.
We are clearly looking at two very different timelines for intervention. Let's step back and summarize the broader strategic picture for the development partners listening.
I think the tension between long-term political mobilization and immediate civic survival is incredibly clear.
From the perspective I've presented, the National Democratic Working Group represents a crucial, structured political and economic alternative. They are cleverly exploiting the ruling party's internal factionalism ahead of the 2027 Congress.
While the Constitution is rewritten today,
But their commitment to a bottom-up, mass-driven approach prepares them for a post-crisis Zimbabwe. Their pragmatic economic blueprint addresses corruption, foreign direct investment, and land commercialization. They offer a sustainable, resilient model that actively transcends the vulnerabilities of traditional civil society organizations currently being targeted by the PVO Act.
And, from the opposing perspective, local civil society leaders argue that this long-term focus fundamentally misreads the urgent reality of March 2026.
Because of the immediate legislative changes.
Yes, the immediate existential threats posed by Constitutional Amendment Number 3, the ongoing abductions and torture of frontline activists, and the complete closure of civic space must take absolute precedence.
You can't plan for tomorrow if you don't survive today.
Exactly. Preparing for a post-crisis Zimbabwe is completely irrelevant if the civic actors required to build that future are eliminated right now. International development partners must prioritize their resources toward legal defense, physical protection, and resisting the immediate constitutional coup that seeks to bypass direct elections entirely.
Both of these perspectives highlight the immense complexity of navigating Zimbabwe's highly restrictive political environment. We are looking at two very distinct methodologies for achieving the shared goal of a stable, democratic society.
It requires understanding the crisis through both lenses. You have to look at the long-term political strategy, but you cannot ignore this stark reality of immediate civic survival.
There is certainly much more to explore within this material, and the strategic choices ahead are incredibly difficult. We leave it to the international development partners listening to weigh these realities, evaluate the evidence presented, and determine their own strategic priorities moving forward. Welcome to the Hard Choices. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.